On the subway, a man came up to me and said, "Are you aware someone's following you? Is this supposed to be some sort of joke?" I pulled out my earbuds and stared at him. He was wearing a gray hoodie and had kind eyes behind thick glasses. He glanced over my shoulder, then back at me. "Don't react and stay still. I'll describe the person to you." My heart started racing, but I kept my face neutral. The subway car was half full with the usual mix of commuters. Construction workers with dusty boots, students with heavy backpacks. Nothing seemed out of place, but this guy's urgency made me believe him. "The person following you is a man with a really long pinky nail. Just one long pinky nail." He pretended to check his phone while talking. I tried to think who that could be. A long pinky nail was such a weird detail. Some people grew them out for guitar playing or other reasons, but I didn't know anyone like that. The train rocked back and forth as we pulled into 14th Street. A few people got off, but most stayed seated. The man continued describing my stalker. "He's a white guy with really long hair. Been watching you since at least 42nd Street. Long hair and a weird pinky nail." My mind raced through everyone I knew. Then a cold feeling washed over me. I only knew one person who fit that description, but it couldn't be him. I hadn't seen my dad in years. Not since he'd left when I was 15. Not since the divorce that tore our family apart. "What's he doing now?" I whispered. "He's licking his lips." Moving closer through the crowd. "We should start walking up the cars." The man stood up casually like he was just stretching. I followed his lead and we moved toward the front of the train. My legs felt shaky as we passed through the connecting doors between cars. The loud clacking of the tracks made it hard to hear if anyone was following. I wanted to look back but forced myself to keep facing forward. We entered the next car and kept moving, past a mariachi band setting up their instruments, around a woman with a stroller blocking the aisle. The man stayed close enough that I could smell his cologne, something woody and expensive that didn't match his casual clothes. Trust me, I know a way to lose him at the next stop. He checked the subway map above the seats. Union Square was coming up, one of the busiest stations with multiple exits and connecting trains. If we were going to lose someone, that would be the place to do it. My hands were sweating as I gripped the pole for balance. Who was following me and why was this stranger helping? The train started slowing down. The brakes squealed and people began gathering by the doors. The man moved us into position near the middle doors, close enough to exit quickly but not so obvious that we looked ready to run. "When these doors open, we move fast. Stay right behind me." His voice was calm but firm. The doors slid open and we pushed through the crowd onto the platform. The station was packed with evening commuters. We weaved between people heading in every direction, up the stairs taking two at a time, through the turnstiles and onto the street where the cold November air hit my face. That's when I saw him. 20 feet behind us was a man matching the exact description. Long greasy hair down to his shoulders, worn leather jacket, and even from this distance I could see that distinctive long pinky nail. It was my father, but different. Older and rougher looking than I remembered. The helpful stranger grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a taxi idling at the curb. We dove into the back seat and slammed the door. The cabbie looked annoyed until the man threw a 20 at him and told him to drive. We pulled away from the curb just as my dad reached the sidewalk. I was breathing hard and my heart wouldn't slow down. The stranger was laughing with relief. We'd made it. We'd actually lost him. Or at least I thought we did. The taxi merged into traffic heading south on Broadway. "Thank you." I don't know what he wanted, but I started to say. The stranger just smiled and patted my shoulder. "Happy to help. Nobody should have to deal with a stalker alone, especially a woman." Then the front passenger door opened. My blood froze as my father slid into the seat like he'd been expecting this. He turned around with that same creepy smile I remembered from childhood, the one that meant trouble was coming. He pulled out his wallet and handed a crisp $100 bill to the man sitting next to me. "Thanks for the help. Worked perfectly." The $100 bill hung in the air between them while my brain tried to process what was happening. My father tucked his wallet back into his jacket pocket and settled into the front seat like we were going on some family road trip. The stranger next to me pocketed the money without looking at me. My hands started shaking so bad I had to grip my knees to make them stop. The taxi picked up speed through a yellow light and I realized we were getting farther from crowded streets with every second. I needed to get out of this car right now. My stomach actually did feel sick from the panic rising in my throat. I grabbed my belly and let out a loud groan that made the driver glance in his mirror. "I'm gonna throw up," I said louder. The driver cursed in a language I didn't recognize and started looking for somewhere to pull over. My father turned around and told him to keep driving, but the cabbie was already slowing down. "No puke in my car!" he shouted. The smell of pine air freshener mixed with old cigarette smoke wasn't helping my fake nausea. At the next red light, the driver hit the brakes harder than necessary. I didn't wait for permission. I threw open the door and stumbled out onto the street. My father shouted my name, but I was already running toward a bodega on the corner. The bright lights of the store pulled me forward. I pushed through the glass door so hard it bounced against the wall. The clerk behind the counter looked up from his phone with wide eyes. "Call 911, please," I said between gasps for air. He must have seen the panic on my face because he picked up the phone without asking questions. I ducked behind the counter where boxes of candy and cigarettes blocked me from the window. Through the glass, I could see my father and Zach standing on the sidewalk. My father was waving his arms while Zach kept shaking his head. They argued for maybe 30 seconds before disappearing down the street. The clerk was giving the address to the dispatcher while I tried to catch my breath. My legs felt like jelly, and I slid down to sit on the dirty floor. Two cops showed up faster than I expected. One was older with gray hair, and the other looked like he just graduated from the academy. They took my statement about the stalking on the subway and the trap with the paid accomplice. The older cop wrote everything down in a small notebook while the younger one radioed for a detective. They gave me an incident number written on a business card and said someone would follow up soon. The bodega clerk came over after the cops finished their questions. He pointed at a security camera mounted above the register. "That camera catches the street too," he said. "Might have the taxi license plate if you need it." I thanked him about 5 times while buying a phone charger and a bottle of water. My phone was almost dead from the day, and I needed to figure out where to go next. The clerk wouldn't take my money for the water, but I left it on the counter anyway. I walked several blocks north before even thinking about getting another cab. Every yellow car that passed made my heart jump. When I finally waved one down, I gave an address 2 blocks from my actual apartment. The driver was playing talk radio and didn't try to make conversation, which was perfect. I kept turning around to check if anyone was following us. My whole body stayed tense the entire ride. The familiar streets of my neighborhood should have been comforting, but they weren't. I paid the driver and walked the last 2 blocks home, checking over my shoulder every few steps. Once I reached my building, I didn't go inside. That feeling in my gut told me my father might know where I lived. I pulled out my phone and texted Kaylin asking if I could crash at her place tonight. She responded right away with her door code and said she'd be home in an hour. The subway ride to Kaylin's felt longer than usual. Every person who got on made me nervous. When I finally got to her apartment in Brooklyn, I used the code and let myself in. Her place always smelled like vanilla candles and coffee. I sat on her couch and waited. When she got home, she took one look at my face and knew something bad had happened. She made us both tea while I told her everything. How my father left when I was 15 without any explanation. How the divorce destroyed my mom. How I hadn't heard from him in all these years until today. She listened without interrupting while I explained the subway stalking and the elaborate trap. "That's so messed up," she said when I finished. We were sitting on her couch with our tea getting cold. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. Unknown number. My stomach dropped as I read the message. "We need to talk. I'm still your father." I took a screenshot before blocking the number. My hands were shaking again. Kaylin took the phone from me and set it aside. "You're safe here," she said. But I didn't feel safe anywhere anymore. My phone lit up with an Instagram notification, and I saw it was from Zach, the guy who helped trap me in the taxi. The message was long and full of apologies, saying he didn't know it would go that far, and that my father offered him $200 because he needed money for rent. I took a screenshot before blocking him too, because I didn't want to hear his excuses about taking money to help kidnap someone. Kaylin made us dinner while I sat on her couch going through my phone settings and changing all my privacy options to the highest level. That night, I barely slept on her couch and kept checking the locks on her door every time I heard footsteps in the hallway. The next morning, my phone started ringing with a number I didn't recognize, but when it went to voicemail, I heard my father's voice for the first time in years. He sounded different, older and rougher, talking about making mistakes and wanting to explain everything if I'd just give him a chance. The way he blamed everyone else for what happened yesterday and acted like trapping me in a taxi was just a misunderstanding made me so mad I threw my phone across the room. I was already 2 hours late for work when I finally got myself together enough to head to the office. My manager pulled me into her office the second I walked in, and I could tell she was worried about me because I looked like I hadn't slept in days. She said we'd need to talk about my attendance issues, but for now she just wanted to make sure I was safe and gave me the rest of the day off to handle whatever was going on. Walking back to Kaylin's apartment, I checked my email and found a message from my building super with a screenshot attached from the lobby security camera. The image showed my father standing by the entrance last Tuesday, and the timestamp showed he'd been there for 3 whole hours just waiting and watching. My hands started shaking as I realized he'd been stalking me for days before the subway incident and probably knew my whole routine. I forwarded everything to the police incident number they'd given me and got a call back within an hour from Detective Valerie Blackwell. She had a calm voice that made me feel less panicked as she scheduled a meeting for tomorrow morning at the precinct and asked me to bring any evidence I had, including texts, screenshots, photos, and especially that lobby footage. That evening, while Kaylin was at her yoga class, I got a fraud alert from my bank saying someone was trying to reset my password from an unknown device. I immediately called the bank and froze my accounts, then spent the next 3 hours on the phone with credit bureaus, freezing my credit and changing every single password I had for everything from Netflix to my work email. The whole time I kept thinking about how my father must have gotten enough of my personal information to try accessing my accounts, and it made me feel violated in a way I couldn't explain. Later that night, I was going through old emails looking for anything that might help the detective when I found one my mom had forwarded me years ago. It was from my father right after the divorce, where he blamed my mom, his boss, his friends, basically everyone except himself for all his problems. Reading it now, I could see the same pattern of manipulation he was using today, acting like the victim while hurting everyone around him. The next morning, I met Detective Blackwell at the precinct, and she was exactly what I expected from her voice. Professional but kind, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. I transferred all my screenshots and files to her computer, while she took notes about everything that had happened from the subway to the taxi trap to the fraud attempts. She explained the process for getting a restraining order, and helped me fill out the paperwork while also creating a safety plan that included changing my routes, varying my schedule, and setting up check-in times with friends. After leaving the station, I stopped at a hardware store and bought a door security bar that would prevent anyone from forcing my apartment door open, even if they had a key. I also got pepper spray and a personal alarm that would make a loud noise if I pulled the pin, then changed my route to work by taking different subway lines and walking different streets to avoid being predictable. That afternoon, another message came through from Zach on a different platform saying my father owed dangerous people money, and that's why he was so desperate to talk to me. He claimed he thought it was just going to be a conversation and it wasn't supposed to get serious. But I blocked him on that platform too because I was done with his excuses. The whole situation was making me realize how many ways someone could try to contact you, and how hard it was to completely cut someone off in the digital age. That same evening, I sat at Kaylin's kitchen table with my laptop and started the long process of securing everything. First came 2-factor authentication on my email, then my social media accounts, then banking apps. Each platform had different steps, and I had to verify through text messages and backup codes. I wrote down all the backup codes in a notebook and stuck it in my bag. Then I set up a Google Voice number and started updating all my non-essential accounts with it. The pizza delivery app, the gym membership, the streaming services, everything that didn't absolutely need my real number. My fingers hurt from typing, but being methodical about it made me feel less helpless. The next morning at work, I went straight to HR and explained the situation. The HR manager pulled up my file and started making notes while I talked. She printed out the photo from my father's old driver's license that I'd found online and made copies for the front desk. We updated my emergency contacts, removing my mom's old number and adding Kaylin and Detective Blackwell. Then she created a code word system, where if I called and said I needed to reschedule my benefits meeting, security would know to call 911. At lunch, I walked out of the building and immediately spotted him across the street. My father was leaning against a wall pretending to look at his phone but watching the entrance. I turned right instead of left and ducked into the nearest deli. The owner saw my face and asked if I was okay. I pointed out the window and said that man was following me. He picked up the phone and called 911 without hesitation. I stayed behind the counter while we waited, but my father must have seen the police car coming because he was gone when they arrived. The cops took my statement and added it to my case file. That afternoon, Detective Blackwell met me at the courthouse to file for a temporary restraining order. The paperwork was overwhelming with pages of questions about dates, incidents, and fears for my safety. She helped me fill out each section, making sure I included the subway incident, the taxi trap, and today's stalking. While we were waiting for the clerk to process everything, she ran my father's name through the system again. Her eyebrows went up as she read her screen. She told me he had an outstanding bench warrant from Pennsylvania for unpaid child support from 2018. She made a call to coordinate with that jurisdiction about potentially picking him up. That night back at Kaylin's, I sat with my journal trying to sort out my feelings. Part of me wanted him arrested and locked up where he couldn't hurt me anymore, but another part worried that would just make him more angry and dangerous when he got out. Kaylin sat down next to me with 2 cups of tea. She reminded me that his choices weren't my responsibility, and I couldn't control what he did, only how I protected myself. The next morning, I woke up to Kaylin knocking on my door holding something with a tissue. She'd found a handwritten note slid under the apartment door with a photo of me from yesterday walking into the deli. The note said, "Meet me alone, or this gets worse," with an address in Brooklyn. My hands started shaking looking at the photo because it meant he'd followed me even after I'd spotted him. Kaylin put on latex gloves from her first aid kit to handle the evidence properly. We called Detective Blackwell immediately and she told us not to touch anything else. She said this escalation meant they would prioritize finding him and she'd send someone to collect the evidence. Within an hour, a cop came and took the note and photo in evidence bags. 3 days later was the restraining order hearing at family court. I sat in the courtroom waiting, but my father never showed up. The judge reviewed my petition and the evidence Detective Blackwell had submitted. Even without my father present, the judge granted the temporary order for 1 year. She explained it would be served by certified mail to his last known address, and by email if we had one. The order prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, or my workplace. The next week, Detective Blackwell called with an unusual request. She'd convinced Zach to cooperate and wanted me to meet him at a public coffee shop with her watching from nearby. I didn't want to see him, but she said he had information about where my father was staying. We met at a busy Starbucks near Penn Station during the morning rush. Zach looked terrible with dark circles under his eyes and his hands shaking around his coffee cup. He told me my father had been staying at a crash pad in Queens with some people he'd met at a bar. He gave Detective Blackwell the address and said there were usually 3 or 4 people there at any time. He also said my father had been talking about needing to get money from me for something important, but wouldn't say what. Detective Blackwell called me the next morning while I was getting dressed for work. She said she'd verified the Queens address through their database and found it was a known crash pad with regular police complaints. She was coordinating with the local precinct to pick him up during their morning rounds when most people would still be sleeping. She told me to keep my normal routine and not do anything different that might tip him off if he had people watching me. I went to work like usual but couldn't focus on my computer screen. Every few minutes I checked my phone for updates even though she said it might take hours. Around lunch I walked to the break room and saw a dad teaching his kid to ride a scooter in the park across the street. The memory hit me hard of being 12 years old in our old neighborhood. My dad had spent a whole Saturday afternoon running behind my bike holding the seat. He'd been so patient when I kept wobbling and falling. He'd bandaged my scraped knee and told me everyone falls before they learn to fly. That version of him seemed like a completely different person from the man who'd trapped me in that taxi. After work, I stopped at the hardware store and bought a new deadbolt, one of those door alarms that wedges under the handle, and a security bar for my bedroom window. The sales guy helped me pick out stuff that would actually work instead of the cheap junk that just looks secure. Back at my apartment, I spent 2 hours installing everything while my hands shook with the drill. I knocked on my neighbor's door, the retired teacher who always collected packages for everyone. I showed her my dad's photo and explained he wasn't allowed near the building. She took the photo to make copies for the other neighbors and said they'd all watch out for me. 2 days passed with no word from Detective Blackwell. I was making dinner when my phone finally rang. She said they'd arrested him that morning at the Queens address just like she'd planned. He'd been sleeping on a mattress in the living room with 4 other people. They found 3 burner phones in his backpack and about $40 in crumpled bills. He hadn't resisted but kept asking them to let him call me, which they obviously didn't allow. That night I actually slept the whole way through without waking up in panic. My body finally unclenched knowing he was locked up and couldn't show up at my door. I woke up feeling rested for the first time since that subway ride. Even my jaw hurt less from not grinding my teeth all night. The next afternoon, my manager asked me to stay after our team meeting. She pulled out a folder and said HR had flagged my recent absences and late arrivals. I handed her the case number Detective Blackwell had given me and explained everything that had been happening. She read through the police reports I'd printed out, and her face softened. She approved flexible hours for the next month and said I could work from home when I had court dates. She also gave me the number for the company's employee assistance program that included free counseling sessions. 3 days later, I sat in the back row of the courtroom for my father's arraignment. He looked smaller in the orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. His lawyer argued for release on his own recognizance, saying he had no prior record in New York. The prosecutor pointed out the stalking charges, the restraining order violation, and the outstanding warrant from Pennsylvania. The judge ordered supervised release with electronic monitoring, mandatory outpatient treatment 3 times a week, and weekly check-ins with pretrial services. The restraining order would stay in full effect with arrest on any violation. My father tried to turn and look at me, but the court officer blocked him. Detective Blackwell called me that afternoon with more news. They'd picked up Zach on conspiracy charges related to the taxi trap. He'd made a deal almost immediately for 6 months probation and 100 hours of community service. She said he'd been crying during the booking and kept saying he just needed money for his mom's medical bills. Part of me felt bad for him, even though he'd helped terrorize me. A week later, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment with a law firm's return address. My hands recognized my father's handwriting on the inner envelope before my brain processed it. I didn't open it. I put the whole thing in a fresh envelope and mailed it directly to Detective Blackwell. She could decide if it was evidence or just more manipulation. Either way, I was getting better at not engaging with his attempts to pull me back in. The community clinic had an opening the following Tuesday for their family trauma program. The waiting room had old magazines and plastic chairs, but the counselor turned out to be exactly what I needed. She specialized in family violence and had worked with hundreds of people dealing with stalking by relatives. We spent the first session just talking about safety planning and better sleep hygiene. She taught me breathing exercises that actually worked when I felt panic rising on the subway. We set 3 main goals to work on over the next few months. First was maintaining my physical safety with consistent routines and awareness. Second was improving my sleep since exhaustion made everything else harder to handle. Third was starting to process the childhood stuff that made this so complicated and hard to navigate. My therapist pulled out a blank sheet of paper and started drawing boxes and arrows. She wrote down every place I went regularly, like work and the gym and grocery store. We mapped out safe routes between each location and backup plans if I felt unsafe. She had me pick 3 code words with Kaylin that meant different levels of danger. Apple meant I felt uneasy but okay. Orange meant come get me now. Grape meant call the cops immediately. We practiced saying them out loud until they felt natural. She helped me set up rideshare accounts under a fake name and showed me how to share my location with Kaylin automatically. We went through every app on my phone and turned off anything that could track me. She made me write down the safety plan and put copies in my purse, my desk at work, and Kaylin's apartment. The next morning, Detective Blackwell called and asked me to come to the station. She had a thick folder on her desk when I arrived. She explained how the monitoring system worked for my father. He had to wear an ankle monitor that tracked his location 24/7. If he came within 500 feet of my home or workplace, it would alert the cops immediately. He had to check in with his probation officer every Wednesday at 10 in the morning. Missing even one check-in would violate his release terms. She showed me a map on her computer with red zones marked where he couldn't go. My apartment building, my office, even the coffee shop I went to every morning were all protected zones. The system wasn't perfect though. The monitor could malfunction or he could cut it off and run, but doing that would trigger an immediate warrant for his arrest. She gave me a special number to call that went straight to the monitoring center if I ever saw him. 2 days later, I had to give a big presentation at work about our quarterly numbers. My hands were shaking as I set up the projector in the conference room. 20 people filed in, including senior management I'd never presented to before. My throat felt tight as I started talking, but I pushed through. I clicked through each slide and explained the data, even though my voice sounded weird to my own ears. When someone asked a hard question about our budget projections, I answered it without freezing up. My manager nodded and smiled when I finished. After everyone left, she told me I did great considering everything going on. That small win made me feel like maybe I could handle this. The credit counselor at the bank had me fill out a stack of forms about the identity theft. We had to dispute 3 credit cards my father had opened using my social security number. She helped me file reports with all 3 credit bureaus and put fraud alerts on everything. We spent 2 hours going through every account and transaction from the past year. She found 2 more suspicious charges at electronic stores I'd never been to. The process was boring and took forever, but each form I signed felt like taking back control. She set up monitoring that would alert me to any new accounts or credit checks. A week passed quietly until I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. The voicemail was from a lawyer saying Zach wanted to help with my case. I called Detective Blackwell first to make sure it was real. She confirmed the lawyer was legit and said Zach had been cooperating fully since his arrest. The lawyer explained that Zach would testify about what my father had told him if we needed it for trial. He knew details about my father's plan to get money from me somehow. I told the lawyer I'd think about it, but I wasn't ready to deal with Zach yet. Even if he felt bad now, he still chose to help trap me in that taxi. 3 days later, my phone rang at 2 in the morning from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail and heard breathing for 10 seconds before it cut off. I knew it was my father even without him saying anything. I saved the voicemail and emailed it to Detective Blackwell immediately. She filed a report about the restraining order violation that morning. The judge scheduled an emergency hearing for that afternoon. My father appeared on video from jail looking tired and unshaven. The judge yelled at him for 5 minutes straight about respecting court orders. She said one more violation would mean 6 months in jail minimum. His lawyer kept trying to say it was an accident, but the judge cut him off. Back in therapy, we worked on my subway anxiety since I still felt sick every morning getting on the train. My therapist taught me the 5-4-3-2-1 technique for grounding myself. Find 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, 1 I could taste. We practiced it in her office first with my eyes closed. Then we went outside and practiced on the sidewalk with real city noise around us. The next week, I used it on the platform when I felt my chest getting tight. I counted 5 people's shoes, felt 4 different textures on my bag, heard 3 different conversations, smelled 2 food carts, tasted my morning coffee. My breathing slowed down, and I got on the train without running away. Kaylin and I started our daily check-in system that week using the code words we'd practiced. Every morning at 9, she'd text asking how my fruit was today. I'd respond with apple, orange, or grape depending on how I felt. Every night at 8, we'd do it again. One Thursday, I got busy at work and forgot to respond to her morning text. 20 minutes later, she showed up at my office reception asking to see me. The receptionist called me confused, and I ran out to find Kaylin ready to call the cops. We hugged and I apologized for scaring her, but I was secretly glad the system worked. Detective Blackwell called with an update about my father's treatment compliance. He was showing up to his sessions but barely participating according to his counselor. He sat in the back and didn't talk unless directly asked questions. But technically, he was meeting the requirement, so they couldn't violate him for it. She reminded me to focus on my own healing instead of tracking what he was doing. 5 weeks after everything started, we had a review hearing at the courthouse. I wrote out a short statement about how this had affected my life. My hands shook as I stood at the podium in front of the judge. I talked about the fear of leaving my apartment and the panic attacks on the subway. I explained how I'd changed my whole routine and spent money I didn't have on security measures. My voice cracked when I described not feeling safe in my own city anymore, but I got through the whole thing without stopping. The judge thanked me for my courage and said she was keeping all restrictions in place for another 3 months minimum. The next morning, my manager asked me to come to her office after I got back from court. I sat across from her desk expecting another talk about my attendance, but she surprised me by sliding a paper across to me. It was approval for a flexible schedule for the next 3 months with the option to work from home twice a week. She said she'd been watching how I handled everything and still got my projects done on time. The company wanted to support employees going through personal crises, and my work quality hadn't dropped even with everything happening. I signed the paperwork and thanked her for understanding. That weekend, I took the subway to Prospect Park, where my dad used to take me when I was little. I found the bench near the pond where we'd feed the ducks every Sunday before the divorce. The paint was peeling now, and someone had carved initials into the wood. I sat there for 2 hours watching families with their kids and letting myself feel all the anger and sadness I'd been pushing down. Part of me kept hoping for a different father than the one who paid someone to trap me in a taxi. The dad who taught me to ride a bike and made pancakes on Saturday mornings. But that person was gone, or maybe never really existed. I cried for the first time since this whole thing started. Not for him, but for the little girl who deserved better. I walked back to the subway feeling lighter somehow. His choices weren't my fault, and I didn't have to carry them anymore. 2 months after that taxi ride, Kaylin helped me pack up my studio apartment for the move. We wrapped dishes in newspaper and labeled boxes while listening to music. The new place cost more but had a doorman and security cameras in every hallway. My bedroom window faced a brick wall instead of the street, which actually made me feel safer. We ordered pizza and sat on the floor of my empty old apartment eating straight from the box. She helped me carry boxes to the moving truck the next morning and rode with me to the new building. The doorman introduced himself and said he'd already been briefed about my situation by the building manager. He showed me how the entry system worked and gave me his direct number. That same week, Detective Blackwell called to say my father had completed his 12 weeks of mandatory treatment. The counselor reported he'd shown up to every session and participated when required. The court scheduled a compliance review for the following Friday. I felt weird about it being good news since I knew he was just going through the motions, but at least the system was making him do something. 3 days before the review, I got accepted into a support group for people dealing with family stalking. The first meeting was in a church basement on the Upper West Side. 8 of us sat in a circle on metal folding chairs drinking bad coffee from paper cups. Everyone had different stories but the same look in their eyes. One woman's ex-husband had hired private investigators to follow her kids. Another person's mother showed up at their job every day for a month. Hearing them talk made me realize how common this was, and how many people understood exactly what I was going through. We met every Tuesday, and I started looking forward to it. The facilitator taught us practical safety strategies and helped us process the guilt about protecting ourselves from family. At work the following week, my manager called me in again, but this time the HR director was there too. They offered me a promotion to senior analyst with a 20% raise. My manager said she'd recommended me based on how professionally I'd handled everything while maintaining my performance. The extra money would cover my new apartment and the security measures I'd installed. I accepted immediately and started my new role the next Monday. The promotion came with a private office instead of a cubicle, which meant I could see who was coming down the hallway. Small things like that mattered now. 8 weeks after that terrifying taxi ride, I woke up on a Saturday without checking my locks 3 times. I made coffee and sat by my window watching people walk their dogs. My phone had been quiet for days with no blocked calls or weird messages. The restraining order was still active and would be for months, but I wasn't living minute to minute in fear anymore. Kaylin came over that afternoon and we went to the farmer's market like normal people doing normal things. I bought apples without scanning every face in the crowd. We sat in the park eating fresh bread and cheese while she updated me on her dating life. My support group had taught me the difference between being careful and being controlled by fear. I was definitely more aware of my surroundings now and had backup plans for everything. But I could also ride the subway without panic attacks and sleep through the night. The safety protocols had become routine instead of desperate. Looking back at everything that happened since that day on the subway, I saw how much I'd changed without meaning to. Thanks for sticking around and wondering through all this with me today. Kinda makes you look at things a little differently, right? I'll see you in the next one. Like the video. It helps more than you think.